do his thing. Thanks again and good morning.
Hi, I'm Tony Biglan. The brains behind this is, I think, Chris Jones. He said I was talking first, so here I am. So, I want to talk about, I want to try and summarize what we have learned over the last 30 or 40 years about the prevention of child and adolescent problems. I had the honor of being on the Institute of Medicine committee that reviewed this evidence, came out with a report in 2009, and I'm going to give you a sort of a light touch on that. I want to start with two critical insights. The first is that most child and adolescent problems, the cognitive, the social, the health problems that Brian was alluding to, are interrelated, that the same kids who have one of those problems are likely to have others. And the second is that all of these problems stem from the same non-nurturing conditions. And that if we can make particularly families and schools, but also neighborhoods and workplaces more nurturing, we can prevent most of these problems. This is a slide which shows the relationship among problems among 8th grade kids. This is from a representative sample of 20,000 kids in Oregon. Just take the third row down, the risky sexual behavior. This shows the relative likelihood that a kid who says that they're engaging in risky sexual behavior is using substances. 6.86 times as likely if they are engaged in risky sexual behavior that they're also engaged in substance use. 7 times more likely to be engaged in antisocial behavior. They're 4.5 times more likely to be depressed, and they're 3 times more likely to have eating disorders. This has been shown over and over again. And yet, unfortunately, we continue to tend to have both our service and our treatment efforts focused narrowly on, some people are trying to prevent substance use, others antisocial behavior, and so on. But when you recognize that these are all interrelated, you begin to say, well, are there common conditions that produce these problems? And if so, if we change those common conditions, can we prevent all of these kinds of problems? I want to particularly emphasize the effects of maltreatment and poverty on health. And I'll particularly talk about cardiovascular disease. There are about 600,000 deaths a year in this country due to cardiovascular disease. If you want to engage the powerful people in our society who are concerned about well-being, you need to include those who are concerned about cardiovascular disease. In looking at this, I found a meta-analysis of 24 studies of the effects of maltreatment, where we found that it was 2.25 times more likely that a child who had experienced maltreatment as a child, when they were an adult, they were 2.75 times more likely to have cardiovascular disease. And so, that's pretty important. And that to me is a way of engaging powerful interests in society who aren't necessarily represented here in being concerned about well-being. Then there's poverty in childhood. It turns out that leads to adults having a 20 to 40% increased risk of all-cause mortality, a 30 to 60% increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and those effects of being raised in poverty are there even when kids escape from poverty as adults. They still have a 20 to 40% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. With one exception, one study I found showed that if kids were raised in poverty and were then out of poverty, if they reported that they had a nurturing mother, their risk of cardiovascular disease was no higher than it was for people who weren't raised in poverty. So it again points to the importance of nurturance. This is a graph that shows, I have a zebra here because there's a wonderful book on the effects of stress by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And this is a graph of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortex. What happens when a stressor is detected by an organism? Let's say the zebra sees a lion. And that causes a cascade of hormones, which results in cortisol, an increase in cortisol, which raises blood pressure, it raises heart rate, and it allows the zebra to run like hell. And so if the zebra is fortunate that there's another zebra nearby who's older and slower, zebra gets away, gets into the woods. What happens to the hormones? They get reabsorbed. The stress is gone. It's over, right? So why do you suppose that zebras don't get ulcers? Well, consider this. Once the zebra's in the woods, it's over, right? But think about this. Have you ever been in bed stressing about somebody who wasn't lying next to you? I think that's almost a universal experience. Human beings can be in the presence of stressful stimuli even when they aren't there, thanks to our minds, thanks to our ability to think about things. And so that's one of the reasons that humans experience so much more stress than other organisms. And so one of the things we need to do is reduce that stress. This is a picture of my son and his son, and it's hard to get you to, imagine hugging an HPA axis. But as I've studied this, I've realized that, in fact, what we need to do is to be nurturing. In all of the venues that we're in, we need to encourage nurturance, not just among the poorest people in society, but everybody. And so this is my offering of how you can do that. So one of the things I've tried to do after being on the IOM committee was to try and boil down what we know into, all of the kinds of interventions, the family interventions, the school interventions, the things that Roger's going to talk about. Could you characterize what are the key conditions of environments that produce kids who are healthy, cognitively, socially, physically? I think there are 4 basic things. The first one is to minimize toxic social and biological conditions. I mean, the social conditions include not just abuse, but even criticism or argumentation or conflict in families or conflict or bullying in schools. These are well-established stressors. And so one of the first things we need to do is minimize these kinds of toxic social conditions. The second is we need to teach, promote, and richly reinforce diverse forms of pro-social behavior. All of the kinds of things that we want our children to be able to do are more likely to happen when we create environments that teach and promote and richly reinforce those kinds of behaviors. The third thing that we need to do is to limit influences and opportunities for problem behavior. And by influences, I'm thinking of things like the marketing of cigarettes and alcohol to young people. There's just one example of an influence that's problematic. But also reducing the opportunities so that we have parents and schools and neighborhoods monitoring what kids are doing to prevent them from being in circumstances that would allow them to experiment with problem behavior. And lastly, we need to promote psychological flexibility, which is a mindful approach to pursuing one's values. I don't have the time to go into it, but there are now more than, this slide is old, there are now more than 70 randomized trials showing the benefits of helping people to be clear about their values and to mindfully pursue those values and not be stopped by thoughts that they can't do it and those kinds of things. So this is a graph that shows, it's a kind of way of thinking about how we could be more nurturing. Start on the right-hand side of this with the primary outcomes, and it lines up perfectly with Brian, which is, I think, why I'm here. Academic skills. We need kids to have the social and emotional competence. We need also that they have as few psychological and behavioral problems as possible, and that they be physically healthy. And most of these outcomes are mediated by biological mediators, neurological development and stress reactivity in particular. And then there are the proximal influences on these outcomes, the family influences, the school influences, and the peer influences. But there are also more distal influences that we need to be concerned about. Income resources, social cohesion, and physical environment. These are the conditions that we need to be concerned about if we're going to try and produce the kinds of outcomes that we're talking about. So one of the things we did was to try to lay this out according to each developmental phase. So what you see here in this slide and in the next slide is a graph that shows that tries to characterize what are the cognitive, social, emotional, psychological, and behavioral and physical developments that need to occur at each of these phases of development. And let me just say 2 things about this. One is that if you go down one of these columns, the cognitive development, let's say, you see that at every phase of development, there are key milestones that a child needs to reach. And if they reach those milestones, they're prepared then to gain from the next phase of development. But for example, if a child arrives at kindergarten lacking the verbal and cognitive skills that they need, they're significantly unlikely to read. And I know that Illinois and many other states are now beginning to try and track the readiness of every kindergarten child so that we can see if we're achieving what we need to achieve. So there's that kind of dependency from each phase of development to the next within each of these columns. But I also want to reiterate something that Brian said. If you go across, let's say, early childhood, across these 4 domains, they're interrelated. A child who develops the cognitive skills and the executive functioning is also going to have the self-regulation of emotional behavior that makes it less likely that they'll get into fights, that they will be unable to make friends, and so on. And so just the cognitive and social emotional are intertwined, and you can't have one without the other. Similarly, children who lack that kind of self-regulation and that kind of the behavioral skills that they need are much more likely to develop problems, psychological and behavioral problems. So if you want to prevent the problems in this psychological and behavioral column, what you need to do is ensure that they're developing the cognitive and social readiness to make friends and to get along with others. And by the way, I'd come back to one of the first slides I showed. If you don't have those first 3 sets of things going, you're likely to have kids who are going to have problems with ADHD, problems with cardiovascular disease, and so on. So I think that's probably everything, because Robin says that I'm out of time. So just one more thing. This is a slide from the Institute of Medicine report, and it shows across the top all of the developmental phases. And every one of these bracketed things refers to typically a set of interventions that have been shown to have a significant impact in preventing the entire range of problems, the psychological and behavioral problems, and ensuring successful cognitive and social development. And so we have quite a variety of things. There are just really literally hundreds of randomized trials that have been done that are sort of the foundation for this graph, that we have the knowledge to ensure that virtually every child, if we put it into place, arrives at adulthood with the skills, interests, and health habits they need to live productive and caring lives. And so if we can get this out and actually put it into place, we can change society beyond anything that we've ever achieved previously. Thank you.